Okay, so today we want to explore a little bit on this discipline of fasting as we continue in these disciplines of abstinence. So here's kind of the outline. We're going to spend most of the day today on this one, and then next week we're going to get all of these, okay? Because these are kind of the main ones under the disciplines of abstinence, and these kind of build on these. And so we'll try and knock these all out in one lesson so that we can get to the disciplines of engagement. Because sometimes I think people think that, well, if you spend all your time talking about abstinence, you never get to the fun stuff, to the good stuff. I mean, this is good too, but good in a different way. You know what I mean? So what we're really understanding in the life that God is giving us and leading us through is that it's really meant to be countercultural. And we don't often appreciate that enough. And sometimes we, to our own detriment, we don't notice enough how countercultural that life is, or how countercultural our life should be or isn't. So we have to, these things sometimes help us get back on track to that, and today's lesson is certainly part of that. So we remember that the disciplines of abstinence, they draw us near to God by creating space for God, creating space for God to fill, and then as a point of focus for cultivating awareness. But I just want to remind you again that the effects and the benefits of these practices are cumulative. You can't expect to do this once or twice and have some kind of benefit from it, or some kind of great, I mean, maybe you will, but the likelihood is that you will only begin to experience the benefit of these things as you put them into regular practice, because they train you. You know, and you have to come back to, like, if you want to pick up 500 pounds at the gym, you don't start with 500 pounds, you know, and you have to, so you start with as much as you can bear, but it's a cumulative process. You don't suddenly wake up one day and say, well, today is the day, 500 pounds, you know. And the same thing goes with these things here. It's a way of living. And I mean, we have said that these aren't supposed to be permanent pieces of your life necessarily. But if you find something of great benefit that really does enhance your life, or at least brings you to a different place in your life that feels like a good fit for you and that kind of thing, you can incorporate it into what we would call a rule of life. And a rule of life is just a way that you outline, these are the values, these are the practices, these are the ways that I intend to live my life. We all have a rule of life. Some of us just know what it is, you know. It's intentional, it's purposeful, but we all have one. And you may find one of these fits into that, and it becomes a rule of life for you, and that's okay. And so God bless you if that happens that way. But remember that what we're really doing is trying to create space for God to fill. So it's not about punishing ourselves, it's not about delighting ourselves, it's about finding a space for God. And we, because of the way our lives are lived, well, we have to purposefully move things out of the way in order for that to happen. And so we want to practice these things to that end. So fasting. This is a little bit like talking about the spiritual gift of celibacy. It's usually a thing that nobody wants, you know. It's the gift I don't pray for. It's the practice I don't want to do. But fasting is very little understood in our contemporary world and largely ignored in the Protestant tradition. So when, back in history, when the Reformation occurred and all that, a lot of these kind of practices that were built into people's way of doing faith were just discarded as idolatry, as stupidity as just religiosity. And so instead of appreciating and bringing, I mean, the answer to bad theology is not no theology, right? The answer to bad theology is good theology. And bad theology can do as much to form your life as good theology can. So, these practices were just discarded by the Protestant tradition. And so, I mean, if you grew up in a typical Protestant situation, unless you're in a mainline church, you know, the more liturgical kinds of things, you probably never had any lessons on this or never went into the Lent was. I grew up, as you know, in a kind of a fundamental Baptist church. I didn't know about Lent. You know, Lent just means somebody gave you something, you know, and they want it back. I didn't know anything about any of these. We didn't talk about fasting. We didn't talk about this kind of stuff. I mean, our preparation for Christmas was one Sunday we sang Christmas music, you know, in December. It was like, okay, now we get to sing Christmas music. But that was it. Easter, we didn't have any preparation at all. We didn't even do Good Friday. It was just like this Sunday, you know, one Sunday it was Palm Sunday and the next Sunday was Easter. We didn't have anything in between there, and we didn't talk about any of that stuff. And it's just the way that they were. That's just the tradition that they did. And so we didn't get any of this, and the Protestant church in a lot of ways didn't get any of this. But it has a long history in biblical teaching. Fasting has a long history in biblical faith. Now, Israel practiced fasting for primarily two reasons. Okay, can you guess what they are? Pretty easy. That just makes it worse, doesn't it? I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You'll know it as soon as I tell you. Think about your stories. When did they fast?
When they wanted something from God.
Repenting. That was the first one. Repentance. So when they were caught in an national. So when they actually listened to the prophets, and wanted to do that. What did the people of Nineveh do when Jonah came? They fasted and repented. And God said, look at that.
If it's tied into repentance, is that a form, are you saying then that's a form of punishment?
No, I'm just simply saying that this is the role that it had in Israel's history.
I didn't mean, are you saying is that, that was used in that time as a form of self-punishment?
No, it was a form of recognition, recognition of my own state and so forth.
Turning away. Is that the second one, recognition?
Actually, the second one is in preparation for special service, for spiritual service. So for instance, Moses, right, fasted before he went, or as he went up on the mountain, to commune with God, to do what? To lead the Israelites through the wilderness, and that whole journey. So that was primary. There might have been other reasons that people did that, but those are the two primary reasons in the history of Israel: repentance and spiritual service, and preparation for spiritual service. And so Jesus, of course, we know, fasted during the 40-day wilderness experience. That's in all of our Gospels. Well, it's not in John, but it is in...
I always thought, the wilderness experience and the fasting, does that mean he didn't eat any food?
That's exactly what I meant, yeah.
For 40 days?
40 days, yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about that at the end of our time together, if we get there. I mean, I know we'll get to the end of our time. I don't know if we'll get to that topic, but yes, it was a 40-day fast, and there's something significant about that. 40 days is kind of a catchphrase in or code, biblical code. But yes, so that's why the first temptation is what?
Oh, the loaves of bread.
Yeah, the loaves of bread. Do this. But there's a very interesting connection to that, which is coming up real quick here. But Jesus, so Jesus fasted during the 40-day wilderness sojourn, not for repentance, but as preparation for special service. Okay, this was moving into this new public dimension of his life, the public ministry. Interesting enough, Jesus assumed fasting as part of the Sermon on the Mount. Remember, as he's teaching through the Sermon on the Mount, he says, when you fast, he didn't say if you fast, if you ever get a crazy notion in your head that maybe you should try this out. No, he just said when you fast. It's just an assumed thing. When you fast, do this. And the early church practiced fasting. And Paul, for instance, was an advocate of fasting and did that as well. So there is a long history of that, and even in the non-biblical tradition or in the non-biblical history of the early church, there is the evidence of fasting in the leaders of the church and so forth. And you remember even in Acts, there is that portion where the leaders of the church there were fasting before God for where do we go next? What's our next step? What do we do? And then so the Holy Spirit has set apart Paul and Barnabas, for this task. And so that was a fasting for spiritual service. What do you want us to do, God? So there is a rich history of this in biblical history, which we don't really know much about and haven't pulled into our own experience of faith. But the roots of fasting are found in Deuteronomy 8:3. And this is a helpful passage for why do we do this. In Deuteronomy 8:3, this is actually God speaking through the mouth of Moses. But in 8:3, Moses is saying to the people, God humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna. Now remember, this is Deuteronomy. All right, so this is the second telling of the law. So this is not the initial. This is Moses speaking to the children of the first generation that passed away. So they're all gone, the ones who experienced all this. So Deuteronomy is the retelling of the law. So this is why he says, we caused you to hunger in the wilderness. If he'd said that beforehand, the first time through, they might have gone, we have to go hungry for how long? And everything. In 8:3, he's retelling the history. So God humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that human beings do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Sound familiar? Where does that come from? Jesus, right? In the wilderness. That's how he responds to the first temptation, is go right to here. God humbled you. So humility is part of the process. We need food, and when we're hungry without resources, we are humbled. We're willing to do whatever is necessary to eat it. You read some of these stories of people experiencing homelessness, and it's appalling to read some of how they manage to scrape together food for the day or whatever. It's just, and you would think, well, nobody woke up one day and said, gosh, I think I'd like to go out and live that way and scrounge dumpsters for, food kind of a thing. But people will do whatever they need to do in that time. The whole Victor Hugo's whole novel, Les Mis, was based on that, wasn't it? Jean Valjean, he steals a loaf of bread, and the whole thing unfolds from there. People do what they have to do in order to survive, and being hungry changes us. You know, people who, we invented the term hangry. You know, people become angry, or at least their disposition changes when they're hungry and they need to have something to eat. Now, of course, there are some people who are physiologically dependent on food in a different way because of some condition internally, and so they need to have food on a regular basis. But yes. So humility is part of that process. But the second part of that wasn't just to make you humble, but what? To cultivate the understanding of dependence and fellowship. That then, as they were hungry, it was God who gave them their sustenance. And in fact, Jesus makes that clarification later in John when, in that famous passage on I am the bread of life, where now this is ironic because, you know, Jesus had fed the 5,000 with just a few fish and 2 loaves and so forth, and immediately they said, well, what kind of sign will you give us to verify where you're from? And he had just done this amazing miracle. What sign will you give us? And then, in order to add insult to injury, or at least to really debase themselves, they stumble into this thing. They say, Moses gave the people manna in the wilderness. What will you do? And you know, Jesus has just got to be, if you can picture Jesus for a moment, he's just kind of looking at him and going, really? This is the question you want answered? Like, what just happened over here? You know, were you there? Did you see this? Do I really have to explain this? But what Jesus does say is very interesting in his response. What's the first thing he says to them? Do you remember? This is not in my notes. This is why we go over time.
Wicked.
He says, wicked and adulterous generation. That's not where he goes. That's not the place. He says that plenty of other times, but
Seeking a sign.
he didn't. Yeah, he didn't say it this time. Do you remember?
Pretty sure Moses wasn't the one taking credit for the manna, too.
That's exactly where Jesus goes. That's exactly where Jesus goes. He says, you know, actually, it wasn't Moses who gave you manna in the wilderness. It was God. It was God who did that. But that's an important clarification, right? It's an important distinction, and Jesus makes sure they understand that because of Deuteronomy 8, where this is a foundational scripture for them. Deuteronomy 8 is the heart of the Old Covenant, so they should know this, you know, easily. God is the one who gave them this food. So their sustenance and their life is dependent upon God, who provides for them with food and what they need to survive in this time of wilderness. So God forces the fasting in order to bring about the recognition of God as source. Now, interesting, the Orthodox tradition and Orthodox theology is different from Catholic and Protestant theology, and sometimes it's very interesting and sometimes it's very confusing and perplexing. But in the Orthodox tradition, they teach that in creation, God gifts Adam and Eve with food. We all agree upon that, right? God gifts Adam and Eve with food, which sustains their life, so their well-being, their very life, is bound up in food, and it is this that becomes for them an expression of God. That food becomes almost, in essence, God in itself, in the Orthodox teaching to Adam and Eve in that moment. And so that they understand that when they eat with God's blessing and fellowship. God said, give you everything, green to eat, that kind of thing, and so forth. So it's an expression to them of God's blessing and fellowship. And one wonders, when the biblical text in Genesis poetically describes God coming to them in the garden in the cool of the evening, one wonders, well, was it dinner time? Was he coming at dinner time? Was that a normal practice that he would do? At any rate, this is the Orthodox teaching that they saw food as the expression of God to them and the thing that contained life. This was what it was. God's life was found in the food. So the sin in the Orthodox tradition, involving food as a matter of fact, right? Interesting, involving food, was to eat apart from God's fellowship, was to eat apart from that, to seek a kind of life apart from God, and then to have God's life for themselves. So it's almost the idea that, now I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just simply saying this is their understanding, and it's interesting to think about what they're suggesting here. Yes, the two trees. You can eat off of any tree, the tree of life, but not this one. And so God imposes a fast on them, a particular kind of fast. And so in that process, they fail to remember a boundary that governed their life. It was just a boundary for them. And the imposed fast from this one particular food was exploited by the serpent, right? By Satan, exploited by the serpent, so that they would ignore all of what they had received from God because of this one thing that God had forbidden. And isn't that what Satan does? Isn't that what the adversary does? It turns you away from all the good things that God has done for us to focus on the one thing perhaps that's missing in our life, or the one thing that's gone wrong, and then it's just everything goes to pot because our minds are so channeled to this one thing. So in the Orthodox teaching then, their understanding was that the sin was to seek a life apart from God, which of course was the outcome of that act. That's what they did. They wanted to have God's life in them apart from God. And that kind of has been the way of humankind since then.
Could you define apart from God? Does that mean they didn't go to synagogue? I mean, what were you talking about?
They were wanting to live a life as though God did not exist. And God did not have a
You're not talking about
part in their
church,
life.
right? You're talking about what the church condemned?
I'm talking about what Adam and Eve experienced and so forth. They were seeking a life apart from the direction of God. I don't think they were, honestly. I think they got duped into that because I think later on they kind of figured out, whoa, this was a rotten deal.
Yeah.
This is not what we signed up for. And it's kind of like, well, this is what you got. But but whenever people, see, this is, well, let me get to this, because I think what's an important principle here is that we live in a world that disregards God, for the most part. And just because people disregard God or don't believe in God or think all that, doesn't make God not present or real, and so forth. But they're living life without regard for God. And so, and whether that regard is philosophical or whether it's whatever the basis for their rejection of God is, they're living as though God has no impact or role in life. That's what it is. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who purport to live, for God, living exactly the same way. Because we live with an idea of God or what we shape God to be, and that may not, in fact, be what God is. And so we have to be careful about those kinds of things. So this boundary that they lived with, this fast that God imposed upon them, was the thing that helped govern their life, so that they would recognize that they lived in a paradise that was gifted to them, and it was the result of God's blessing upon them. So, bearing these ideas in mind, then, we come to understand that fasting helps us to recognize or to reclaim the sense of God's good gifts. And it seems counterintuitive to see fasting as a means of recognizing giftedness. But remember, I talked about being countercultural. And the idea is that sometimes we place ourselves in a position to consider what we don't have. Sometimes the best way to this is free too. Sometimes the best way to figure out how to interpret a passage of Scripture that puzzles you is to say to yourself, what wouldn't we know about God without this passage? If this passage wasn't here, what wouldn't we know about God? That's a quick way to figure some of that out. And you may still read that and go, well, I have no idea. That's okay. Give it some time. Maybe you'll get to the place where that will become clear. But it's sometimes helpful to know what wouldn't we have. And so fasting is a way of sometimes recognizing that perhaps we have placed ourselves in a position where we have taken for granted or we have assumed sovereignty over this area of our lives, and we haven't recognized the sense of God's good gifts and presence. And that fasting helps us to recognize that the higher value in all of this is the nearness and intimacy with God, and our understanding of God as the source of our life, and fasting helps to put that into focus. Yes.
So thinking back to when you were speaking on solitude and silence, for me the hard part about fasting is more the mental discipline of why I should be doing it, because when I go without food, all I want to think about is food.
I'm about to get to that point. I'm about to get there.
Yeah.
But thank you for bringing that up, Peggy, because that's exactly what we need to do. That's exactly one of the things that this does. And actually, I have that question in here. What does God want to accomplish in me through this practice? And we'll do that. So we recognize that food is necessary to life, but we've made it more necessary than God. Just think about that for a moment. We've made it more necessary than God. How often have we neglected to remember God's presence when we would never consider neglecting to eat? Yeah.
It even kind of relates to there's much less observance of prayer before you.
Yeah. Well, isn't this what grace is all about? It's not about a protective element over the food. It's not like if you forget to say grace, suddenly the food becomes, non-edible, poison, dangerous, whatever.
We were taught that in high school.
When I was a kid, that's why I thought we did it. When Dad said grace at the table, I thought we did. And if you didn't do that, somehow the food became problematic. So you always had to do that. But interestingly enough, in the Jewish tradition, they offer grace after the meal. Thank you for the good gifts you have given to us. We bless you and praise you for your abundance.
I think anybody that's actually tried fasting even for a short period of time, less than a week, that thankfulness for what you do have when you eat maybe is enhanced.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, that's the point. That's where we're getting to.
Well, that's kind of a subtle difference between the prayer I grew up with before we ate was, bless us, Lord, please, I guess, for your majesty and your bounty. And as an adult, being married, being introduced, we do a different one, which is the, is there a name for it?
Come Lord Jesus.
Be our guest, let these gifts be blessed, which is kind of what you're talking about, the difference between blessing the food somehow, making it holy or something, as opposed to thanking for food.
Yes.
Subtle difference.
Yeah.
I thought about that.
But there's also a subtle difference in those prayers too. Can you pick it up?
When you're introducing Jesus into the meal itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of them recognizes that God is already present and has given us all these other things. The other one is come, as though God isn't already there. Come, and as though who is. So here's a pet peeve. Also free.
You You guys have anything to throw just in case you're ready? You know?
And yeah, that would be appropriate, wouldn't it? So the pet peeve, and I don't mean to be pejorative, and I don't want to put anybody down or anything, and I maybe shouldn't even share it. But one of my, and this comes from decades in ministry, is the fact that it's God. It's God who saves us. And so when we respond to God, we're simply responding to what God had already planned and prepared for us. And so we receive it with thanksgiving and gratitude and awe and wonder, but we recognize that we are now drawn into the center of God's life because of what God planned ahead of time, as opposed to a more contemporary evangelical view of it, that we accept Jesus into our life. Well, who controls that equation? You know, we do. We do. And suddenly Jesus is in the middle of our life instead of us in the middle of Jesus' life. And that sounds like a semantic, hair split. But I think it's an important difference, because I think it governs the way we think about who we are in Christ. Because if we accept Jesus into our life, and we are the ones that do that, then we also are the ones that control how much of Jesus we want in our life, how much we'll follow Him, and when we want to listen to Him and when we don't. And honestly, everyone is as spiritual as they want to be. God doesn't love you any more or any less, depending on how much you do these kinds of things. But I think it's important mental distinction to remember that the goal is for us to be in the center of God's life, not for God to be in the center of our life. And I think that's an important distinction because of who controls what happens. I didn't mean to get off on that because of that. You just touched that little thing, and so.
Well, understanding that, I do think also, though, in the recent weeks, you have said, at least from our perspective, that some of what we're doing is our way of seeking God. Mm-hmm. That there's an element of our desire and
mm-hmm.
action mm-hmm. that isn't taking credit.
Right.
And you're making a different thing. What's the center? Is
mm-hmm.
it me or is it God? But I mean, there's still a call for action, and He delights as a father when the children seek Him.
Well, yes. Yes.
I'm not saying you were disagreeing. I'm just restating other things you've said.
Yes. But even when we seek, we do so as a response to the God who's already seeking us. Amen. The last psalm, the very last psalm, after you get through all of the psalms, I think it's the second to last verse, where David says, "Seek me, God, for I have strayed as a sheep." And so even when we, that's okay. That's a whole other thing, and we are running out of time, and so we want to get to Peggy's question here. What we have to remember is that fasting brings us face to face with how we put the material world ahead of its spiritual source, and we have done that. And remember, this is just simply a tool. This is not supposed to be a virtue in any sense to say, look at how great I am because I can fast. This is a tool to help what? Open our understanding and create space in our lives for that place that God owns and God has created. So, the question that Peggy asked, what does God want to accomplish in me through this practice? And so here are some aspects of that and some possibilities for this as an answer. And so first I would say that one of the things that we need to learn is that a life that recognizes no limits cannot recognize the sovereignty of God. I mean, it is God who is sovereign. It is God who determines the life that we should live and how to live it and so forth. And, even in the Psalm cycle today, which is one of my favorite Psalm cycles of the whole month, Psalm 24, the earth belongs to the Lord. He's sovereign over all of it. And so there is this sense of the sovereignty of God determining how life should be lived and so forth. And God is not an ogre saying, don't do this because it's bad. God is saying, this is destructive. This undercuts and undermines the life that you can and should and are designed to live. And so God is not a cosmic killjoy. God is simply saying, that's bad for you. This is not good. And so the sovereignty of God just simply recognizes that there is a way that God has designed life, and there's a lot of different ways to live that life within the design of God, and that the great joy in our life doesn't come from chasing joy, but from finding God. And that when we agree with God in that whole process, joy becomes the outpouring of that, or the outcome of that. But when we find that agreement with God, then we also find the sensibility of the life that He's given us to live. And one of the things that I think is really important for us as Christians to remember is that part of our witness to the world is to demonstrate the sensibility of living under God's direction. To say it makes sense to live this way. And so we don't have to push it to say, you're being evil or you're being bad or you're being corrupt or anything. I mean, people usually know that about themselves anyways. We know that about ourselves, when we have strayed and so forth. But one of the great pleasures and joys of the Christian life is to be able to demonstrate the sensibility of the life that we live under God's rule, and to offer that. To say, there is an alternative way. You don't have to live like this. It doesn't have to be this way. So fasting helps us to recognize that there are limits in the life that God has given us, not because God is withholding them from us, but God is leading us into the fullness of what God intends for us to live. So there are some limits, but a life that recognizes no limits doesn't recognize the sovereignty of God, cannot. The second thing, when created things have become an end in themselves, instead of a means of divine grace, they can no longer offer real life. So food, for instance, for some people, just like, and we'll talk about this in just a second, there's a lot of different things that have become ends unto themselves in our lives. And they can no longer give life that way because we seek in them something they were never designed to provide. And so that's a second lesson here from fasting, that we recognize that food is not an end unto itself, but a means of divine grace. And then the third thing is similar to the first thing. Fasting is a means of recognizing boundaries that bring life into alignment with the purpose of God for it. But some outcomes that we get from this help us to see that we receive from God these gifts that sometimes we have taken for granted at the most benign, in its most benign form, or we control and command in its most, toxic form. So fasting in all of its forms shifts us away from a consumer mindset. Everything, which is that everything within our grasp is ours to use, as driven by our desires for self-satisfaction. How many times have you seen like a television commercial? Are you hungry? You shouldn't be hungry. You should not be hungry. If you're hungry, have a candy bar. Or, hey, call up Uber and get, it delivered to your door. Or how many pizzas can satisfy that? How many, if you've ever had to fast because you were doing a blood test for the doc, something in the morning, and you're watching television, isn't it amazing how you are caught by those food commercials? So it does grab our attention. It does grab our attention. And what we see then is that we aren't living in a world that is ours to necessarily consume. Remember, we are stewards of the world that God has given us, not owners of that world. And so food is a way of helping to focus that, to say, yes, we need it, but it comes from God. But what can we gain? Let me answer your question with a few suggestions. What do we gain by doing that? So by imposing a boundary upon ourselves in fasting, we learn how to manage our impulses to self-indulgence. Okay, we learn how to manage that impulse. And what's interesting is it becomes easier to refrain from excess in all areas when we've learned to do it with something relatively safe. Honestly, there's nothing good or evil. Well, there can be something evil about what you eat. I mean, if you're not supposed to eat certain foods, then you do. That's a problem. But it's a relatively safe thing. This is a safe environment to learn in. And so when you've learned how to control your impulses in eating, it becomes easier to control them in other things because you know how to do it. And eating is a relatively easy, safe kind of environment to learn that in.
And in our time, we don't have to, for fasting, we don't have to go without food for days. It can be a fasting of, say, for me, ice cream and Cheetos,
Not at the same time, right?
No. Same here, though. No, but the whole thing of, you can be one with God if you're eating like the simple foods and the healthy foods and being grateful for those natural things that He's provided. But if I go out and buy a bunch of junk food that's not really a source of nutrition or feeding, then for me there's a difference between the two.
Well, yes, there can be. There are.
Because those things can feed the ego or you can eat emotionally.
Yeah. Because we're finding in them something that they're not intended to provide.
Right.
Yeah. We are creating in them an outcome that they're never intended to give.
Right.
And so that's true, not just with food, but with other things as well. But yes, in terms of fasting, you can do a normal, a partial, or an absolute fast. And so normal would just be, no food but juices or that kind of a thing.
No meat on Friday.
Partial could be a certain food, like you've indicated, or like you just said.
That's a Catholic tradition.
Yes, but a partial fast is just a fast from something in particular, not that. And then like an absolute fast is what Jesus, did, no food or water for an extended period of time. But you shouldn't start with that. Okay, don't start here. It doesn't end well.
The idea of food draws our whole attention while the fast is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the expected process, or should I replace something in the time that I would have been eating that'll keep me from thinking about it? Or
Well, here's something.
What we hope will happen.
Here's something. Where is it? So
I think that's part of what Peg was.
So we discover in fasting, we can discover our poverty of spirit that fails to gain our attention in the way that hunger does. We may be really, really hungry, but then this may teach us that we're not hungry enough for the things that really matter. So perhaps what you experience in the gnawing is to say, okay, I wish, not for a hamburger, I wish I had this same kind of deep gnawing desire for God. And maybe that's what this does, is it helps us to see that our spirits need to be as nourished as our bodies. That perhaps we, by fasting, recognize the need to invest more time in spirit. And so yes, you can use that time that you would normally give to eating to something that would replace that, but not as a replacement to distract you from not eating, but simply to say, God, what do you want to do in this moment here? You know?
Or you can just bow down and say, help me through this because I'm having hunger pains that I just can't stand.
I think I would rephrase that to simply say, please make my spirit as hungry for you as my body is now hungry for food. You know? And perhaps those are the kinds of things that they're very elementary lessons, but I mean, they help us to gain a new perspective on what it is that God may be doing. Plus, we may gain new insight and empathy for people who are experiencing involuntary fasting. You know? Gosh, I'd hate to feel this way as a regular basis. And what can we do about that? Is there something I need to participate in that will solve that for something else? Maybe we gain insight into how we waste or squander or exploit, you know, the food that God gifts us with. I mean, I'll let you go with this. One of the things that really made me sick, honestly, is one time we went on a cruise. And I don't know if you've ever been on a cruise, but there's a particular day on that cruise where suddenly the kitchen explodes into creativity, and you're supposed to, you know, line past this buffet of greatly fashioned food that, you know, sometimes looks like cities, sometimes looks like all kinds of things. It's this adornment of food, because, you know, on the ship you can eat anytime you want. All right, and usually it's already all paid for, kind of thing, and so forth. So you just indulge yourself whenever you feel like eating. And our son-in-law always ate when he was a kid. Never passed the ice cream machine without getting a cone. And our boys ordered bagels at 3 a.m. with extra cream cheese. So it's a lesson in indulgence. But it was gross almost to see this display of food, exquisitely crafted indoor. You weren't supposed to touch it, and we certainly weren't going to eat it. But you were supposed to just admire the work of the chefs. And I thought to myself, how many people would just die, you know, to dive into something like this? And we're using this as ornament, or like the hot dog eating contest on July 4th. Honestly, makes me sick to think about that.
It's not lightweight to do that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. Why does he do that? Why does anybody think that that's even entertaining or should be done when we have people living with food insecurity in our world? It just kind of stuff grates at me. So in fasting, we learn a little bit about how to be hungry for the things that really matter. I mean, it's hard, honestly, we've talked about this before, it's hard to pray, give us today our daily bread, when our pantries and refrigerators are overflowing of food. You know, and so we have to come back to a place of appreciating the provision we get from God. And so there are plenty of books on how to do this. There didn't used to be, but there are now. There are plenty of books. And you have to recognize your own particular nutritional needs and plan accordingly. You know, don't leave here if you're a diabetic and say, well, Frank told me not to eat anything, you know, for a week. I didn't say that. So, so before you begin, here's the most important part. Pray about this. Have spiritual preparation. Have this conversation with God. I want to experience, so prepare for it. Don't just suddenly wake up one morning, I think I'll fast today. But spend time praying about it. Say, God, okay, I want to do this intentionally and I want to do it purposely. So prepare my heart, prepare my spirit for this time. And then recognize the cumulative effect. You may have to do it for a while, not consecutively, but over time. So once a week, twice a week, or twice a month, whatever works for you, but do this over a period of time, and remember what happens to you in that time, and recognize it may take time. I read a journal from somebody who started this, and it took 2 years for them to finally come to a place of recognizing, wow, this has really been amazing because of this. And they were able to really reflect on the things that they had learned. I'm not saying it's going to take you 2 years to do this, or that you should only, after 2 years develop this, but give it time. Don't do it for one day and think, wow. But go easy. Go dinner to dinner, maybe, and go from there.
Some of the things that you could say, here's when I'm going to intentionally do this, but you could have some of the other things that you have on the list of things that you put in place of not eating.
Mm-hmm.
So you would say, okay, I'm going to twice a month, twice a week, but I'm going to go into solitude. I'm going to do one of, so that way you kind of give yourself
Piggyback, yeah.
Yeah, and you think about the things that you think would help you to be more faithful to getting it back to God. Or so.
Okay, so and now I'll let you go, honestly. So here's how not to do that. I'm going to fast for lunch. So in order to distract myself, I'm going to go shopping. But you just defeated the purpose, right? Because what you did is you substituted shopping for food. That's all.
One desire for
It's one desire for another, So, but we do this. We do this. Okay. I'm going to deprive myself. So then I'll go to some other thing that I think will fulfill that need in me. And this is what we're trying to break, is the idea that we produce these kinds of, or that these things are to produce this for us. The whole point is not it's to get close to God. That's the point, right? Okay, I have extended my time over you. I apologize for that. But thank you for your kind attention.